A quick note for our listeners. In October, we invited Malcolm Gladwell to Rotman to talk about his new book, Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Superspreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering for our Visiting Experts podcast. In a departure from our usual format, we filmed this interview. You can listen to an abridged audio version or subscribe to the podcast by clicking on the link below. Welcome to Visiting Experts, a Rotman School podcast for lifelong learners exploring transformative ideas about business and society with the influential scholars, thinkers, and leaders featured in our acclaimed speaker series. I'm your host, Brett Hendrie, and I'm joined today by Malcolm Gladwell. For decades, Malcolm's prolific writing has been turning complex research into insightful stories and influential ideas. Through his many mega best-selling books, including The Tipping Point, Blink, and Outliers, Malcolm has been helping us understand the trends and forces shaping our society. Malcolm is also the co-founder of the Pushkin Industries Podcast Network, an audio content company, and he's been named to Time's 100 Most Influential People list. And we're proud to say he's a graduate of the University of Toronto. His latest book is Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Superspreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. Malcolm, welcome back to Rotman and the University of Toronto. I'm excited to talk about your new book, which is fantastic, but I wanted to set the stage for our audience a little bit by going back almost 25 years to the original Tipping Point, which was, of course, hugely successful, but especially so with professionals and leaders and executives. When you look back on that book, what were the ideas in it that resonated with professional audiences, and why did the business community gravitate towards it so much?
It's a really good question. It's hard to know, with kind of perfect hindsight, but I think the thing about epidemics that was and remains really interesting and somewhat unintuitive is how asymmetrical they are, that they are sustained by very, very small groups of people who are kind of outside the norm. In my current book, I return to that idea and talk about that in the context of COVID, how COVID was an epidemic sustained by a very, very small group of people. But, when that book came out, when the first book came out, The Tipping Point, it was just in the kind of, at the beginning of the rise of the idea of segmentation and, the idea that marketing could be way more precise in how it addressed audiences. And I think my book kind of rode that energy and gave a kind of a broader theoretical explanation for why that would be a useful strategy.
Right. And of course, that would be something that business leaders would want to grapple onto in terms of understanding how to shape those forces. So here we are almost 25 years later. What compelled you to revisit this topic? Obviously, there's been a lot of social change and technological change. Is it that the world's changed or your outlook has changed or a bit of both?
I mean, I wanted to do I was originally just going to do an anniversary edition, a kind of update, and then got halfway through and realized that so much had changed and there were so many things I wanted to address in more detail that it would make more sense to write a new book. And in particular, we'd just been through two of the greatest public health crises of the last 100 years have happened in the last 10 years, the opioid crisis and COVID. And so I wanted to give a kind of full accounting of those two epidemics and our understanding of how epidemics work as a result, in large part, of those two epidemics has really kind of deepened. I feel like opioid crisis in particular has kind of, it's why the book begins and ends with that story.
I was going to say, your book is fantastic because there's so many fascinating stories from Medicare fraud in Miami to the biased admission practices of the Ivy League. But as you mentioned, you bookend the book with the story of Purdue Pharma and the rise of OxyContin and the opioid epidemic. And that's a business story. What did that story reveal to you about how social epidemics can be engineered?
What's interesting about that is that Purdue Pharma is an extraordinary innovator when it comes to marketing drugs in a way that is quite sort of diabolical. But it also, were they not dealing with a dangerous and deadly narcotic, we would consider them kind of heroic marketing practitioners. They understand that, normally in drug marketing, you have an assumption of a kind of bell curve distribution, a normal distribution of your sales targets, and you target the big fat middle and send out an army of marketers to reach doctors, a broad spectrum of doctors. And they were really one of the first to say, actually, no, if epidemics are started by a very small group of people at the margins, then it must follow that if we want to make an epidemic out of our drug, that we can safely ignore 95% of doctors. I think people underestimate the extent to which they ruthlessly applied this kind of principle to the promotion of OxyContin. In the United States, they realized the universe of doctors who were in the business of prescribing painkillers was 160,000. And they were really only interested in about 1,500 of them. Find me another company that identifies its target market as being 160,000 customers and decides to spend all of its time on 1,500 of them. Like, that is ruthless segmentation. And that proved to be, again, within a Machiavellian diabolical context, a brilliant strategy. That's all they needed. In fact, there was by the time OxyContin gets shut down, 1% of American doctors are prescribing half of all the OxyContin consumed in the United States. So they realized you can move an entire marketplace by focusing on the smallest fraction of your consumers.
Is the lesson of Purdue Pharma and what they did with OxyContin that we necessarily need to fear this type of social engineering, or can their strategies and tactics be used for more positive purposes?
They can absolutely be used for more positive purposes. But I would say that what is useful about understanding the nature of their marketing effort is that it helps us to diagnose what the problem is that we need to fix. There was a real feeling after the opioid crisis, or we were still in the middle of it, that the beginnings were kind of diagnostic of some structural problem with the medical community, that the medical community did not know how to handle a dangerous narcotic. And when you look at what Purdue did, you realize that is exactly the wrong conclusion. There was nothing wrong with the medical community as a whole. The medical community as a whole completely understood how dangerous this drug was and didn't prescribe it. But a tiny, tiny group of people who were on the very fringes of their profession violated professional norms. And so you realize that what you have is a bad apples problem and not a structural problem. And I think that the inability of us to distinguish between those two very different kinds of problems, bad apple problems and structural problems, is it's a real problem.
Yeah. And of course, the medical community probably didn't realize in the moment the adversarial forces that were being engineered behind the scenes.
They were taken by surprise, I think.
Yeah. One of the great takeaways from your books in general, and this book in particular, are these takeaway structures and ideas and frameworks that are really useful for leaders. And in this book, you introduced the idea of the overstory. Yeah. Explain to us what you mean by an overstory.
I've always been very interested in the extent to which context and environment shape individual behavior. And for some reason, I keep coming back to it because I feel like it's very hard to get this message through. We always default to this notion that what matters is our own internal motivations, and that of much sort of less importance is the way in which external forces operate on us. And I think that's exactly backwards, that the principal forces that motivate people are external. And understanding the nature of those external influences is, to my mind, the kind of true task of any student of human behavior. And in this book, I got very interested in the regional specificity of behavior? How much behavior, whether we're talking about professional behavior within a given domain or just everyday kind of consumer behavior or individual behavior, seems to be very, very powerfully influenced by a community level. And that struck me as something, it's an observation that was first made in the medical community, talking about the way doctors practice, but it struck me as being kind of broadly true of any number of different things. And you need to come up with some kind of theory to explain what's going on. If you observe that cardiologists in Buffalo are behaving very differently from cardiologists in Boulder, Colorado, they're trained at the same schools, they're coming out of the same intellectual discipline, they're reading the same scientific papers, they are seeing patients with the same problems, and yet they are behaving in a way that's fundamentally different. You have to have some explanation for that, right? So that's what led me into this whole idea of the overstory, which is a very kind of vague and seemingly kind of whimsical concept. So my use of the term overstory, I borrowed it from, it's a term that biologists use to describe the upper canopy of a forest. And everything on the forest floor is shaped by this canopy up above. But, it's not like the world on the forest floor is actively engaged with what's going on, way, way, way up in the sky. So it's sort of this kind of hidden influencer that casts a shadow on everything underneath. And I thought that was a lovely metaphor to describe the ways in which common narratives kind of hover above human society.
And so if you're a leader trying to create a culture of excellence on your teams or a culture of innovation, what advice or what stories come to mind in terms of how they can use the idea of the overstory to create that culture, that environment that fosters excellence?
It's a super interesting question. We have with the overstory idea, I think, the beginning of an understanding of something that has been kind of widely observed about peer businesses in a given marketplace, which is we see companies that appear otherwise identical that have wildly different performances, right? 2 restaurants selling the same food, one of which is a huge success, one of which is a failure. And so the question has always been why, and we're always left with this kind of, either we look for some kind of structural reason that's sort of hidden, or we say it has to be culture. And what I'm doing is validating the kind of cultural interpretation and saying these cultural variables are real and dramatic, and they clearly come from somewhere and can be sustained under certain circumstances. There are a set of stories, a set of narratives that groups have about who they are and why they do what they do and what the purpose of their endeavor is. And paying attention to those, the nature of those stories, I think is a kind of underappreciated part of what it means to build a successful organization.
That really comes through in the book, and that, it's important for leaders to, as you say, be deliberate in crafting what those stories are and setting the tone and the culture for their organization.
So I started this audio company. I'd never started a company before, but I helped start one 7 or 8 years ago. And we did actually, because I'd been thinking about this idea for a while, we were quite explicit in the beginning about who we were and what we stood for. And one of our core ideas, and I kind of wish it had even been more core, was that what we do is fun and needs to be fun, and that excellence in our world comes from people who are enjoying themselves.
Right.
That's what a listener responds to. That's how we can attract talent. That's how we can retain talent. All those things, and that idea that everything, all our profitability, everything stems from the idea that people want to come to work in the morning. And when we've had trouble, it's when we've forgotten that idea.
Right.
We haven't kind of, you realize these narratives need to be reinforced. Another narrative, we're in Canada, for a 60-year stretch, Canada had a narrative about accepting outsiders. Right? Now seems to be maybe the narrative is undergoing a little bit of correction, stressed at the moment. But what's amazing to me is how long it. Very few countries in the world have a 60 or 70 year history of opening their doors to everybody. For years and years and years, Canadians and Australians to some extent were basically the only two countries in the world where the majority of the country thought that immigration was a net plus for the nation. That's really unusual, and that's because of an overstory that was actively promoted and sustained by the leadership and the cultural institutions of this country.
Yeah, and really the framing of the overstory of Canada as being strength through multiculturalism.
Yeah. And I remember as a kid growing up here in the 70s, being aware of that kind of messaging, which was an obsession in the Trudeau years, thinking that it was kind of excessive. And now I realize, no, it was like brilliant. It was one of the great accomplishments of an otherwise, mixed set of results for that administration, for that government. But it was an extraordinary thing.
One of the other ideas in the book that I wanted to explore was the idea of the magic third and how group proportions can be determinative and influential in terms of outcomes. Can you explain to us what the magic third is and your conceptualization of it?
So this comes from a very, very famous paper written by Rosabeth Kantor, famous professor at Harvard Business School. Early in her career, when she is called in to consult for a Fortune 500 company that had, for the first time, hired women on its sales teams, and the women were doing very badly, and they wanted to know why. And they bring her in, and she interviews them all, and she comes to the conclusion that there's nothing wrong with the women. They were extraordinarily well equipped for the job. There's nothing wrong with the company. The company culture is not toxic. What's wrong is they didn't hire enough women. She sort of takes the whole debate about diversity and reorients it towards numbers, towards group proportions. Her point is there's a world of difference between being the only woman in a group of 10 men and being one of 4 women in a group of 10 men, or 3 women in a group of 10 men. Her point was for outsiders to be themselves and fully contribute to a group and not to be tokens, they need to have a certain critical mass. And so she reorients us to think about where is critical mass in group life. Her suggestion was that critical mass lay somewhere between a quarter and a third. And I sort of pick up on various strands of research that suggest that there does seem to be something remarkable that happens to a group of outsiders when their numbers reach that threshold, that that is the point at which the group of outsiders changes the culture of the majority group.
And indeed, you did some anecdotal research speaking to female executives who had been on boards of directors, and
yes.
And they had provided their own experience of what it was like being one woman on a board,
and then 2, and then this is really fun interviews. Actually, called up all these women who were kind of pioneers on corporate boards, and said, "Okay, when you were the only woman, what was it like?" Terrible. I was ignored. I'd say stuff, and then a man would say the same thing, and everyone would say, "That's a great point," like as if she didn't exist. One woman told me a group came in to brief the board, and everyone on the board lines up in a row, and the consultants coming in shake everyone's hand and just like walk right by her, like she doesn't exist. And I said, "So did things change when there were 2 of you?" Because she'd been on boards where a second woman would join. She goes, "Not really. I mean, it was a little better, but not." What happens when you had 3 when the third woman joins? She goes, boom. It just changed. It was like all of a sudden she was seen for who she was. Women couldn't be ignored. When they said something, people listened to them. They felt they could be themselves. There is some kind of experimental research in social psychology to suggest this is a real phenomenon. There is this critical mass in group dynamics when a group becomes impossible to ignore. And what's interesting is it's not at a half. And what's also interesting is it's not at one, right? Not when one outsider joins. There is some point in the middle.
In the case of seeking diversity, it's almost like at the point of a third, they become validated in a way that it's not just difference for difference sake, that their intellectual diversity as a team or a group has reached, as you said, a point of critical mass.
Yeah.
Another example that you bring up in the book, which was really interesting, is how the response was to executives like Ursula Burns at Xerox and Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo. Ursula Burns, African-American woman, Indra Nooyi, an Indian woman. And can you share with us how the response to them rising to the CEO office was different from other executives from different communities who came in later on?
So I tell the story of these two women who rose to be head of Fortune 500 companies. And in both their cases, they were among the first, if not the first, of their kind, both woman and ethnicity, to reach that position. And what happens to them is exactly what you would predict when you're the first one in, is that they do struggle to be seen for who they are. So both of them, Ursula Burns, for example, who is born in the early 60s, so she's entering the workforce in the 70s. She's a black woman and an engineer. She was throughout her entire career, almost up until the very end. She was often the only black person, often the only woman, and certainly the only black woman.
Right.
And she had this experience of just how strange it was to deal with to be in that position.
Right.
And how much things have now changed to the point where now when an Indian or an African American rises to that position, their identity is no longer news, no longer this kind of
the primary
focal point of the attention in the way it was in the beginning.
Yeah. It really speaks to how things can change as the numbers mount over time. One of the other laws or principles that you revisit in the book is the law of a few, and how a small number of people can have an outsized influence on the outcome or the result. How has your thinking evolved or changed in terms of that idea from your original book?
In the case of COVID, we learned by the end of the pandemic that the percentage of the infected population that was responsible for passing the virus along was tiny. It was like, it's basically 2 or 3 out of every 100 people are really the ones who are doing the work of contagion. That is just so much lower. In the business world, we're used to the notion of 80-20. 20% of people are the kind of... We're talking now about, in both those cases, OxyContin and COVID, a much more extreme version of that. We're talking about 95-5, not 80-20. So it's not just an asymmetrical distribution, it's a radically asymmetrical distribution. And it's made me wonder in how many instances there are radically asymmetrical distributions. So I had a conversation with a criminologist, it's not in my book, but afterwards, who studied homicide in the west side of Chicago, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in North America, a neighborhood of 50,000 people. And he's created these network maps of people who are implicated in gun violence. And his point was, at any given time, there are only 400 people who are really at risk for gun violence on the west side of Chicago. It's a community of 50,000. Our assumption when we hear about the west side of Chicago is like the whole neighborhood is rotten and dangerous. At this point, he says, no. It's like, it's a radically asymmetrical distribution. Like 400 people are the focal point of the violence at any given time. And that means 49,600 are outside of that kind of, that is just so different from our intuitive sense of what it means for a neighborhood to be dangerous, that it forces a real reconsideration of what do we mean by when we use those terms? Should we even be using that terms? Should we stop calling the west side of Chicago dangerous?
It's a fascinating example. And I think, as you said, people are so used to the idea of 80-20, but in terms of where we are now, in terms of big data and segmentation, the idea to really zero in on micro target a few influential people or people who can spread things is fascinating. We're close to having to wrap up our time, but I wanted to end with a question of advice that you would give leaders. So for people who are leading organizations and want to protect their communities or their businesses from malign influence in an age of social engineering, what advice would you have for those leaders?
To pick up on what we've just been talking about is understanding the kind of, understanding how to model change or phenomenon is really important. So the question of radically asymmetrical distributions, it's a modeling question. Is the problem that we're dealing with a normal distribution, a bell curve, or is it this kind of hockey stick where all the activity is happening at one end of the distribution? That's a really, really important question to ask. The other thing I'll point is, you said that AI are these sort of much richer reservoirs of data that we can now work with, will allow us to pinpoint far more precisely the kinds of people we're interested in and why. And that's there's many number of implications of that, but one of them is that it's a very, very disruptive observation to the way that organizations operate. It's like the analogy I was given, basketball started going down this route, and you realize very quickly if you do advanced analytics in basketball that the very best basketball player, LeBron James or Steph Curry, is not worth 10x what the average player is worth. He's worth like 100x what the average player is worth. In fact, if you have two people who are in the 90th percentile, you almost doesn't matter who else you have on the team. That, goes against everything we understand about a team. So the team isn't really a team, is it? It's two superstars and everyone else doesn't really matter. So these are disruptive notions. And I think we have to, if we're going to get into a world where we can actually very precisely quantify the contribution of various players in an organization, and we can recognize how radically asymmetrical their contribution is, we have to rethink how what being a member of a group means, or a member of a team means.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I think the key word really is disruption. And so for so many of the people who come to Rotman and listen to this podcast, understanding how to navigate disruption, both good and bad, is a real challenge for them. But those are great thoughts for them to take away. Thank you so much for being here, Malcolm. Congratulations on the book. It's full of fascinating stories and your typically fantastic writing. The book, again, is Revenge of the Tipping Point: Overstories, Superspreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett.